Hello and welcome to another of the eBiology Teacher Podcasts. I'm Mr. Doc, and today we are approaching a very sensitive subject. Now I want you to look at the distinguished gentleman to my right. Who do you think this guy is? Huh? No, it's not my grandfather, and no, it's not me without my makeup on. That is Charles Darwin. Now, a lot of people would have you believe that that is the sheer face of evil, okay? When in fact he was probably just a little misunderstood. Actually, he's still a lot misunderstood by some people. Charles Darwin was the founder of the theory of evolution. And of course, that's what we're going to be talking about today. Darwin's ideas have led to quite a bit of controversy, but what we're going to find out today is there's a lot of science that back them up. And they're really not that controversial to begin with because a lot of them make sense, okay? So I know some people start out conversations about evolution very fearful of what they're going to find out. What I want to share with you at the beginning of this is this podcast is not designed to question what you believe. It's to provide you with an explanation that science uses to explain how our world is how it is today. Again, this is science's explanation, and there are other explanations out there. And we're not going to get to the validity or lack thereof of any other idea. What we're going to do is we're going to say, here's the idea that science has, and here's the evidence that they have to support it, and then you can make your own conclusions from there. Okay? So let's take a look real quick at what we're going to be looking at today. First, we're going to take a look at a little bit of the history of the theory of evolution, and we're actually going to define what the theory of evolution is because there is some confusion about that. We're going to explain the process of natural selection, which was really Darwin's main idea. We're going to talk about the types of evidence that we have that suggests that evolution does indeed take place. We're going to compare anatomical structures between organisms along with other types of evidence. And then finally, we're going to hint at, and we'll talk about it more in another podcast, we're going to talk a little bit about what science has done to determine the origins of life, which is really where all the hubbub comes from. So let's talk about what we already know. We already know, hopefully, that organisms depend on each other for survival. This is something that we established early on in our study of biology when we said that interdependence is a theme throughout the whole of biology. But we also studied it at great length in our series on ecology, because ecology was in fact the study of how organisms are interdependent on one another. Now, if an ecosystem changes, if the environment itself undergoes change, organisms really only have three options. They can migrate, which means they can get on out of there. They can adapt, meaning that they have the genetic ability to get used to a new change. Or they can die, which I guess most people would say is probably not the ideal option. It's important to note, and this seems a little redundant, but I'm going to say it anyway, dead organisms can't reproduce. So if an organism has the ability to either migrate or adapt, it means that if it survives, it has the ability to have offspring, which means its genetic material is going to be passed on, which means that the next generation is also going to have the ability to either adapt or migrate. The organisms that die probably die because they didn't have that ability in the first place. Now, this takes us to a little misconception that a lot of people have. Can an organism go, oh, well, I'm just going to learn how to deal with this? In a rare instance. Generally speaking, when we talk about the ability to migrate or adapt, we're talking about having the genetic ability to do that. If the genetic ability to adapt or to migrate doesn't exist, then there's only one option for that organism. So that's why genetic variations are very important, because the more genetic variations we have, the more likely that one of those genetic variations will provide for the survival of the species if the environment changes. All right? So back to it. In the 1830s, a British scientist by the name of Charles Darwin was traveling on a ship HMS Beagle through the Galapagos Islands. Now, he was the ship's naturalist. His job was to observe nature and bring back the things that he observed, basically. And a little side note, because we're going to get to this in a couple of minutes. Darwin had another job before he was the naturalist on the HMS Beagle. He was, in fact, a priest. Right, I'm just saying, just throw that out there. All right. When he got to the Galapagos, he was amazed. And by the way, the Galapagos are off the Pacific coast of South America. He was astonished at the diversity and the uniqueness of the species that are there, but he also was confounded by the fact that even though there was this wide variety of species, a lot of them had certain similarities that seemed adapted to their environment. They seemed like, wow, that's a good adaptation if you're going to live in the Galapagos. So he started to make some notes. He continued to make these observations and was convinced that somewhere along the way, these ancestors of, these organisms had to have common ancestors, because even though they were diverse, they had they had a lot of things in common. So what this told him is that over time, they had to sort of spread out. They had to start getting different, or they underwent differentiation. In other words, species, in his mind, have the ability to change over time. And changes become so varied that new species ultimately are formed. That, my friends, is the theory of evolution. I'm going to say that again. Species have the ability to change over time. That's the theory of evolution. What? I thought evolution had to do with us coming from monkeys. The theory of evolution is just that. Organisms have the ability to change over time. That's it. The idea about people coming from monkeys and common ancestors, which we'll get to later, has to do with the theories on the origin of life. Which is why it's weird when people get really upset about talking about evolution, because if you think about it, species have the ability to change over time. That makes complete and total sense. Of course they do. Of course species have the ability to change over time. Humans used to be a lot shorter and a lot different than we are now, even a couple of 100 years ago. So species do change over time. We know this. All right? So when we start talking about what's controversial now, the theory of evolution really isn't. Really, most people completely agree that organisms have the ability to change over time due to changes in their environment. Makes complete and total sense. All right? Now, Darwin said that the driving force behind evolution is what he called natural selection. This is the process by which organisms with more favorable traits survive longer and reproduce more. Now, this has come to be known as, quote unquote, the survival of the fittest. But it's important to note that the term fit doesn't necessarily mean strong. It means well suited for the environment that they're in. Okay, so let me stress that a little bit. Survival of the fittest doesn't necessarily mean strong. Now, if you and I were in an arm wrestling contest, right, strength would be the surviving factor. Strength would be the one that makes most sense. But if you and I were having a survival competition on Jeopardy, and the winner of Jeopardy got to survive and the other one was tossed on a pike somewhere, obviously strength really has nothing to do with it. It has to do with intelligence. So in that case, intelligence is what makes you more fit, not strength. So it depends on what situation you're in as to what fit really means. All right. Sometimes fitness just means the ability to climb, whereas another organism can't, or meaning the ability to adapt, or the color of your fur make you more. I mean, if you live in an environment where it snows a lot and there are always predators, and your fur is white and your friend's fur is brown, guess what? You're more fit, because you're going to blend in and your friend's going to get eaten and won't be your friend anymore. Tear. All right. So, what causes natural selection? Well, the forces behind natural selection are relatively simple. First of all, overproduction. That means a species has more offspring that can survive to reproductive maturity. So as an organism has offspring, the more likely that those offspring are able to survive to the point where they could have offspring themselves, make that species more likely to survive. Genetic variation, which we've already hinted at, is the idea that individuals in a population have different traits ranging from anything from color to size to strength, speed to whatever. The more genetic variation within a species, the more likely that one of those variations will code for an advantage down the road. A species' ability to compete also has to do with natural selection, meaning that a species that is better able to compete will more likely get the resources, will more likely survive, and therefore will more likely reproduce. And the final driving force behind natural selection is what is referred to as differential reproduction, meaning that organisms survive due to their fitness for the environment, and those traits that are favorable are passed on to their offspring because the organisms chosen to reproduce are the ones who have the favorable trait in the first place. I'm going to spend a little more time talking about this real quick just because I think it bears repeating, all right? In differential reproduction, the idea is that, okay, you have a trait that's beneficial. It helps you survive. Well, you will be chosen as a mate more often because your trait means that your offspring are more likely to survive, which means that your traits are going to become more common in your species overall. Okay? So that means that as a certain trait becomes more favorable, that organisms with that particular trait reproduce more often, which means that trait becomes more frequent. And that means that the species starts to change in that direction. We get more and more frequent. I'll give you an example of differential reproduction that was very, very similar to one that I just mentioned. Jackrabbits live all over Indiana. I mean, you can't go anywhere without seeing them, little brown and gray rabbits. Thousands of years ago, overpopulation occurs and they are forced to migrate north because of lack of resources. They were overgrazing, and the only thing to do was to get more food, and more food to go north, right? Well, when they got there, they realized as they go more north, it snowed a lot. And it turned out that wolves and foxes kind of liked jackrabbits. They're quite tasty. So what would happen is that the wolves and the foxes would pick off the dark brown and almost dark gray black rabbits because they were easy to see. They're black rabbit sitting on the snow or brown rabbit sitting on the snow. It's real easy to see. It was the lighter gray rabbits that survived because they were better able to blend in with the environment. So over time, organisms started, the rabbits themselves would choose the ones that survived, obviously, because you can't reproduce with a dead rabbit, right? But the ones that were surviving were gray. So that means that their offspring were more commonly gray, which means that the population of rabbits that lived north were lighter in color as on average than the ones that lived further south. Over time, lighter in color was preferred, differential reproduction occurs, lighter in color, until now you have white rabbits in Canada because over time they got lighter and lighter and lighter due to differential reproduction. All right, so that's how the snowshoe hare came about. And at that point we have what's called speciation, which means that the jackrabbits and the snowshoe hare became so different that now they're two separate species, even though they started as the same. All right? All right, back to the grind. Here are some ideas that help support the idea of evolution. First of all, we use information from the fossil record, and we're going to get into this more in detail in another podcast. Fossils indicate that species in the planet have become more complex and have become more adaptive over time. The picture you see on the screen is actually what's becoming more and more commonly accepted, and that is that the early dinosaurs were actually predecessors of what we know as birds today because of anatomical similarities. As a matter of fact, a recent study suggested that some dinosaurs actually had feathers, and they've even been able to determine that the feathers on many of the dinosaurs were red because they found pigment in the fossil record. Now, I don't know how much of that is true, but it's a recent discovery. Thought you might like to know about it. As time goes on, and as we look at the fossil record, and as we date things that are older and then newer, we can kind of put things in chronological order, and we can see, while these species seem to be related, and the next species seems to be related to the middle species, or what we call a transitional species. And as we track them over time, we start to see it looks like this species over time evolved into this species, which evolved into this species, which evolved into this species. Very simple. Another idea that supports evolution is the idea that there are structures that are similar. There are three terms that we use to describe these. They are homologous, analogous, and vestigial. Homologous structures are structures that are both similar in function and structure. So that means if you look at the forelimb, for example, of the human, the penguin, the alligator, and the bat, those seem to be the same shape, the overall same function. Those would be homologous structures. Analogous structures are structures that, while different in form, serve the same function. All right, so that means that they've become more different over time. They still do the same thing, but they don't really have the same form. That indicates perhaps a lack of connection. And then vestigial structures are structures that have very little function but resemble other structures of another organism. So these are structures that perhaps indicate a similarity in the past, but because that structure isn't very useful, it's diminished over time, meaning it's become less useful. Other evidence includes the following. Now, what you're looking here is embryological development of three different species. The first is the dogfish, which is the common shark that you've heard people dissecting in biology classes, the dogfish shark. The chicken, and a cat. If you look at how these organisms develop, we can clearly see similarities in how they develop. All right. Another thing is, if you remember back to our studying of DNA, remember that DNA has 4 nucleotides: adenine, thymine, cytosine, and guanine. Well, those same 4 nucleotides are in every organism, from the simplest bacteria to the most complex organisms on the planet. We're all written in those same 4 letters, it's just the letters are in different order. That's something that all organisms on the planet have in common. Another piece of evidence that supports evolution is that many of our biological functions that are regulated in the biochemical way have very similar, if not identical, components, meaning that all organisms, for example, use ATP as functional energy. That's something that all organisms have in common. Certain enzymes are common to almost all organisms. For example, the enzymes that regulate DNA replication, the polymerases and whatnot, they're the same in all organisms. So once again, these all point to similarities in terms of evolution. That takes us to the big question. And before we talk about this, I want to make something abundantly clear. The theory of evolution and the origins of life are two separate ideas. Now, the theory of evolution supports the scientific theory on how life originated on the planet, but the ideas themselves are separate. So it is very simple to say, I agree that evolution occurred. I understand it and I get that, and it's beyond reproach that just makes complete total sense. And you can still disagree with the scientific theory on the origins of life if it contradicts, say, with your faith or something like that. So you don't have to pick and choose between evolution and faith. What you can say is, I think evolution does occur. I still believe in my faith because it's the origins of life where I disagree with science. And that's okay. You as a person have to decide where the evidence lies and what decision you're going to make in terms of what you believe. Again, on our next podcast, I'm going to give you a little bit more specific information on the scientific theory of the origins of life. I'm going to start now, and then we'll move on to a different podcast later. In the 1920s, scientists by the name of Oper hypothesized that since all the elements needed for organic compound formation were present in early Earth, because we know that matter can't be created or destroyed, he had the idea that under the right conditions, certain organic molecules could form on their own. In 1953, Miller and Urey were able to set up an apparatus that controlled the conditions that Operin suggested, and they were able to form some simple organic compounds. And to my knowledge, it was small amino acids, not anything major like long protein chains or nucleotides or anything like that. So they were able to synthesize some very rudimentary, very simple organic molecules. At this point, science has not been able to replicate nor completely substantiate the idea of spontaneous generation. And the idea behind spontaneous generation is that everything needed to form life was on the planet and it just kind of happened, right? We've not been able to recreate that. And in science, that's kind of our benchmark. We need to be able to substantiate something using experimentation. And since we can't, or since we haven't, we really can't go beyond the theoretical realm, which is why there are many different theories about how simple organic compounds came to form living organisms. So there is some disconnect there. There are a lot of theories, but very little substantial proof. And I do want to caution one thing, and this is going to sound weird coming from a science teacher. This is a criticism that I have of the scientific community in general. The absence of proof of one thing is not proof of another. Okay? For example, and I'm going to be very careful here, the absence of proof that there is a God does not prove that there's not a God. Okay? You can't make that connection. The lack of evidence of A does not mean that B has to be the answer, because there could be a C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, or K option along the way. So we have to be very careful. And in terms of scientific thinking, we've got to connect the ideas and say, what information do we have to substantiate certain theories versus what we know to be fact? And that's the connection that as an individual you have to make. All right. And in our next podcast, by the way, we'll get into a little bit more about the origins of life. We'll get into how we date certain not date as in let's go out, but how we figure out how old things are. And we'll get into some more specific details, and we'll also talk about patterns of evolution, meaning as a species, how things change and diversify and become different species. So before we go, let's recap what we've learned today. First of all, remember that Charles Darwin was a naturalist on the HMS Beagle in the 1830s. He went to the Galapagos Islands off the Pacific coast of South America, and he was astonished by both the diversity and similarities of the organisms that he found. He then decided to analyze his information and came up with the idea that organisms have the ability to change over time. That's a theory of evolution. And he said that the process of evolution occurs by a process called natural selection, which simply put means organisms that have the traits that better make them able to survive are the ones who get to survive and reproduce. And of course, the organisms that get to reproduce are the ones whose genetic material is passed on, which means that the future generations will look more like the organisms that survive, because that's the genetic information that gets passed on. Different types of evidence for evolution include fossil evidence, which indicates that species change over time. Anatomical similarities between organisms indicate that they do have similarities or suggest that they have common ancestry in their past. DNA evidence certainly suggests that all organisms have something in common, since we're all written in the same 4 nucleotides, just in different orders. And biochemical evidence certainly supports the idea that we have common biological processes that occur in all living organisms. And of course, embryological evidence suggests that some organisms are connected because they develop in almost identical ways. Homologous structures, when we talk about how we compare anatomical structures, are those structures that have similar form and function, meaning that not only are they shaped the same, but they do the same thing. Analogous structures are forms that, while they do have a different structure, have the same basic function. And vestigial structures indicate commonality because even though they have very little function, they still indicate a similarity between separate organisms. And finally, what we know about the origin of life is that, first of all matter on the planet has always been here and will always be here, which means that the matter from which the first forms of life started were here. And yes, there were some conditions that indicate that certain traditionally biological compounds or organic compounds could form without pre-existing living organisms. But that's about all we know for certain. From there, you'll have to make your own decisions, or you'll have to watch the next podcast, which will be posted soon. So I hope this has helped. And I have a sort of a personal motive here, and that is I hope that you understand that the idea of evolution doesn't necessarily contradict faith. You can believe in both as long as you know enough about both. And if someone says you can't believe in faith and believe in evolution, well, they probably don't know enough about evolution. And if somebody says, well, you can't believe evolution and faith, they probably don't know enough about faith. All right, that's just my own personal comment at the end, and then we'll call it a day. All right, I'll see you here next time. I hope this helps, and have a wonderful day.